evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. So, I am Jarmajat. I'm working as an intelligence analyst at Euroscope Desk at Global Eye Intelligence. Today, we have with us Dr. Madhumati Deshpande. Dr. Madhumati Deshpande is a department coordinator, associate professor in the Department of International Studies, Political Science and History at Christ University, Bangalore. She has completed her MPhil and PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dr. Deshpande has been previously working at the observe has been an observer at the Carter Center in Atlanta, USA, and observed election at East Timor and Guam. She has also worked as editor for Springfield Reference Work. She has several articles published in various peer-reviewed journals and many book journals. Her area of interest are political theory, international relations, and foreign policy analysis, along with Asian studies, Indian foreign policy, and US policy. So today we are here to discuss on the crucial topic of challenges in global governance. Ma'am, I would like to have a brief introduction from you about the overall idea of global governance.
Okay. This is very basic for students of international relations and political science, that global governance is an attempt at building a government which can take care of the administrative and collaborative experiences for different countries, although not having the authority to control them. Global governance is the main characteristic of a global governance is that it is voluntary in nature. It does not have the authority to force its regulations on countries, and the countries accept it voluntarily. And they do it because of several reasons. Countries accept global governance even though it may impinge on their sovereignty to a little extent. All governments accept it because it is the only way to collaborate with other countries. It is the only way to make sure that the global issues are addressed collectively, and that every country, no matter what the size, has access to other countries, whether they are allies or not allies or enemies or have never heard of those countries before. That is what global governance is: voluntary in nature, and countries accept it because they want to cooperate with each other.
So when we talk about the idea of global governance, how has the idea of global governance evolved in the past few decades, specifically after the post-World War II era?
Okay. So global governance, the attempts at global governance started off even before World War II. There were functional organizations like the International Telegraph Association, because countries started sending telegrams. This is even before telephone, this is even before text, way before. Mail, postal organization, because post and telegram, because those were the means of communication between the countries. So how do you send a letter from India to another country? I mean, there was, of course, no India at that time. It was British India, so they could take them over there. But if you were to send from one country to another, let's say from France to Germany, from France to Britain, because most of the European countries were the ones that were independent, and they had to do this kind of telegram, postal mailing, all that had to be done. So somebody has to decide on how the mail gets from one country to another. You may just say, okay, I'll put it in a truck and send it to another country. But how do you decide whether it is going to one country or other country? There has to be some delegation that needs to be done in order to divide the groupings, regions, so that it becomes much easier, not as difficult. And it was, I mean, we have to think about 1800, 1900. We're not thinking about 2000 here. It was not easy for traveling communication. So the functional groupings, organizations came together at that point of time, which were, of course, European in nature, because not all countries were independent, but the same idea developed later on because it had to function with all other countries that became independent also. So those functional governments were already in existence. There was an attempt even before World War II, the League of Nations came into picture. The League of Nations again was led by Woodrow Wilson. The idea there was to how do we share the common seas, okay, the law of the seas, or what is now known as the UNCLOS. The idea of that came in during the League of Nations. That how do we share? The seas are shared by everybody. The oceans are shared by everybody. And that was the time when the navies used to use the sea more often. The travel used to happen through the oceans more than the planes. So how do we share those territorial waters which are close to one country and not close to the other country? How do we decide whose territorial waters they are? For that also, then there had to be a convention where countries agreed that this is what we will call as territorial waters, and we will give passage to any ship that is going through the narrow straits, which may be shared by two countries. How do you decide those rules when there are areas that had to be commonly shared? How do you decide on the rules that had to be commonly done for, as I said, communication, navigation? Once the planes started moving about, how do you decide on the flight path? Because it is going to go over another country. It's not going to stay in your country. It's going to go over another country. How do you decide rules which will go across the border? That was the idea for global governance. The global governance in the political sense, as we know from the League of Nations, came from the first attempt was the League of Nations. Before that, there was a Concert of Europe. There was the Convention on Diplomacy, and that happened in Europe before World War I. But this League of Nations had countries apart from Europe. There were other countries as well, but didn't last as long because not all the main countries were the signatories. Like the United States was never a part of the League of Nations, and the United States became much stronger after World War I. So the idea of a global governance came from League of Nations. And so when the World War II happened and most European countries were really bombarded and had a lot of deaths and they were tired of wars, the European countries, along with the United States, agreed that there shouldn't be wars because you're losing population, you're losing economy. So there had to be an end to this war. And that's when the San Francisco conference happened, wherein they decided that the United Nations was supposed to come up in order to stop all wars from now on. That was the main intention for the establishment of the UN. I guess they knew that, once they started cooperating, there would be more number of things that they would take on. I mean, if you look at what League of Nations was addressing at the time, League of Nations was worried about refugees. They were worried about medicines. They were worried about diseases like leprosy. They were worried about telecommunication. How would, they send, and arbitration and court cases and arbitration, international arbitration. These were the things that League of Nations was worried about. The same was transferred to the UN. UN took over all of these along with political collaboration, cooperation, and to put an end to all the wars. These are all the functions that the UN took up. So we have the UN agencies that came up. We also had something known as trusteeship council for the newly independent countries, which had to become, either democracies or at least know how to govern themselves. There was the mandate system that transferred to becoming a trusteeship council. So this was an evolution of how global governance and global issues came to be came under one organization so that countries would talk to each other about solving these issues or addressing these issues. Forget about solving, but at least address the issues so they don't become too much of a problem much later on.
All right. So just as you said that the solving of global issues or maybe just addressing of the global issues form the basic cause of emergence of global governance institutions. So definitely we'll be looking into the details of those institutions. But just to get a crux out of it, I would like to know from you, how have these global governance institutes have been performing as per the task mandated to them? And do you think that they are still serving the purpose for which they were actually established?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to remember the time that it was established at. It was right after World War II. And as I mentioned, what League of Nations was worried about were completely different things. I mean, if you think about leprosy now, it is a disease that has been taken care of. I know we struggled for a longest period of time, and we had Mother Teresa sitting here in Calcutta working on the same thing. But it is a disease that is long forgotten. It's no longer a concern anymore. But does that mean that we don't need any sort of a collaboration with other countries for other diseases? Pandemic showed us that if you don't collaborate, you can't address a global issue like a pandemic. So even though there is a lot of questioning on global governance, and a lot of people say that the international organizations have not been successful, especially in the last 2 3 years when we see wars happening in Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza. People question the validity of these global governance institutions and say, what are they doing? They're not doing anything at all. So when things of that nature happen, we usually question it. But imagine what would have happened if we had no United Nations, if we had no global governance system. How would we have navigated the seas and the space, and after globalization, the travel around the world, the number of refugees moving from migration, forget refugees only, we have legal migrations that are happening across the world. How would we have managed all of that if there was no global governance system? We do have, I mean, whatever was established in post World War II, they have evolved over a period of time too. As I mentioned, there is no trusteeship council anymore because no country needs to learn how to run itself anymore. Even the ones that become newly independent, United Nations can handle it and say, okay, we will establish a temporary administrative unit for you. You start governing yourself and we will pull out. There is no need for a trusteeship council to be permanently established to run the countries anymore. That is long gone. But yes, I mean, United Nations needs to have more of those reforms, but without having a global governance system, we would be in so much trouble every single day that it's impossible to think of a world without world governance. Despite the fact that they are not as effective, despite the fact that there needs to be a lot of reform, the global governance works in many ways, even though if it doesn't work in some ways. Should we take questions now, or
Uh, yes,
did I see a hand
we'll
up?
be taking the question at the end of the session. Yes, you
Okay,
can just note
all
down your
right.
question.
If
We'll
you
be
can,
taking
yeah,
that.
please put it down, that would be easier. All right.
Ma'am,
So for
building
me,
upon,
it's
yes.
important to have the global governance system. Yeah, go ahead.
Ma'am, I believe that will be the most beautiful line I've ever heard in terms of global governance institutions. That the purpose they were meant to serve, however, they are still serving some purpose. So, building upon that, I would like to ask you that the rise of multipolarity as well as geopolitical competition that we see in terms of US-China rivalry or US pulling out from World Health Organization, along with EU's strategic autonomy and BRICS expansion. Do you think that the idea of global governance is becoming more fragmented than cooperative?
Sure. Yes, it is becoming fragmented, and it is becoming, and as I said, we do have a lot of people questioning it because we do see that rivalry between US and China. We do see the wars like the Russia-Ukraine, and nobody can do anything about it because Russia has a veto power, and Israel-Gaza because US has a veto power. Nobody can do anything. And yes, it does become challenging at times like this when we see that things cannot work as we wish them to, when the United Nations is, his hands are tied behind its back and nothing can be done. But uh, the United Nations was an inspiration for even regional organizations to take up the slack. That regional organizations decided that even though the UN may not, even though UN is a platform for all countries, the regional issues may not be addressed during the United Nations. So let's take it up regionally, and we will solve those concerns that we had in the regions themselves. So we have the ASEAN, we have the European Union, we have regional groupings that have come up, which has fragmented the global governance to a certain extent. But these regional organizations are also doing the same work that the UN was doing. It may not be doing it politically as well in the UN, but the regional organizations have taken up that work and have taken over the political part of it. So European Union is united in its political stand. It may not agree with the rest of the P5, but they are solving their own disputes, their own problems within a region. So the global governance model has worked regionally in order to solve regional issues, which then do not become global issues. And that also addresses definitely addresses the political part of it. We have the Bretton Woods system, which had the IMF and the World Bank, and later on we came up with the WTO, World Trade Organization. But it is not Bretton Woods, but we have the World Trade Organization that is now solving economic issues. So it may not be just one UN which solves the problems. The work has been divided among different groups of organizations which have taken up the work of or the framework that UN had established and continued the work even though it is fragmented. So even the fragmentation is actually helping because it has diversified the work that one organization was doing. So it still is global governance. When you look at World Trade Organization, it is still addressing global needs. Yes, once again, there may be issues with the World Trade Organization because we have one global power that suppresses all the others, or one global rivalry like the US and China rivalry, which may suppress all of the other issues that may come up. But it is still a framework that can help other countries. So it is fragmented, no doubt, but that fragmentation has led to these other regional groupings taking up the same model, but helping in the region itself. So fragmentation, true, but it's not for any negative, it doesn't put in a negative effect on it. It does help in global governance because you are doing the same work anyways.
Just as you said, ma'am, building upon the WTO point that you just referred. So I believe that WTO was always built upon the principles of free trade and the transnational trade between the countries, open and free trade. However, we see a sense of rising protectionism and sort of economic nationalism, not just from the developing world, but especially from the developed world at this point. So, do you think that these frameworks of Bretton Woods or WTO they need to adapt to a framework which brings out much more solid sense of economic stability in a more sustainable fashion?
Yeah, I know when we say nationalism, we start talking about Trump too much. So let's not get sidelined by what he has said or what he will do. We have to wait and see what he does. But yes, I mean, WTO was the baby of the United Nations. They were the ones United Nations and the United States, they were the ones who wanted free trade. And they believed that free trade was going to solve all the world's problems and that, you know, free trade is going to help even the poorer countries to become capitalistic. And yes, everybody will benefit and everything will work out. But soon they realized that when you say free trade and when you start letting countries which are already powerful, making them economically powerful, giving them the access to the whole world, meant that this is unchecked capitalism in the rest of the world, which may not be ready with their own industries, with their own businesses to take on the multinational companies. That's when they realize that there has to be some control or some sort of conditioning that has to be done and help that is needed for the countries that have just become independent and do not have the resources or capacity to develop themselves into becoming major world powers. So the WTO was set up to solve those, the conflicts that arose between the developed and the developing countries, the trade issues among the developed world also. They realized that those, even though we say free trade, even though we say that all countries should have access to all other countries' markets, they realized that there is a problem in allowing everybody to take over everybody else. There was a period of time when we had what is known as the banana republics coming in, the banana republics in the Central Asian countries, wherein US multinational companies took over countries by themselves in actually growing bananas. Countries like Guatemala, countries like Costa Rica were taken over by multinational companies, and they started growing bananas because United States had a demand for bananas and they couldn't grow bananas themselves. So not only did they grow bananas, they took control of those countries. The countries' governments were in the pockets of multinational companies. And that's when they were called as the banana republics, because they lost their own sovereignty to make their own decisions. The decisions were being made by multinational companies. So this realization came that it is not easy to just open up economies for unchecked capitalism, and that there should be some sort of control over these companies. And that's when World Trade Organization also came up with rules and regulations, and that differentiated responsibilities. And this differentiated responsibility is not just for climate change, but also for trade. And they were able to. So this is again the discussion on free trade also didn't happen overnight. This was a long process that started from General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. This was called the GATT. In the initial period of the United Nations, there was a discussion on GATT. There were several rounds of discussions between the developing and the developed world. And this is where the G77, the G120, all the groupings of developing countries, along with non-aligned movement, came together as the southern countries and demanded these things from the developed world. So this collaboration, this kind of interaction led to the establishment of WTO. And then once the WTO was established, the WTO is now is addressing the conflicts that comes between the two groupings. I mean, South and the North, they have different demands from the WTO. And yes, once again, the whole issue of is it biased or is it only catering to the needs of the developed world also comes in. But of course, and they do hold the purse strings of WTO and the United Nations because they're the biggest contributors to the membership and the funding that comes for WTO and the UN. But once again, imagine a world wherein all multinational companies would take over all the developing world. It would be back to what we had as colonization or imperial powers taking over. We would be back to that. We wouldn't have the freedoms that the countries have now if those rules and regulations hadn't come into place. So WTO is, yes, there is the discussion that WTO becomes biased at times because they are ruled by the more economically richer countries. But then you have to remember China is also siding with the developing world, even in this case, the BRICS countries, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They came together not only in WTO, but also in climate change talks because their interests are similar. Their interests are, yes, they will continue with protectionism because their industries, their businesses still need protection. Whereas US would say that protectionism is going to hurt free trade. But now we see, the change happening and Trump coming over and saying, you have taken over our market, so I'll impose tariffs on everybody, which is not going to be easy for the US economy either. So we'll have to see how his reverse, the reverse tariffs or reverse protectionism or isolationism will work for the US economy. And then he might come back and say, okay, fine, it's okay with protectionism. So they might change what the understanding of developed world is about developing world. You never know. But yes, we do have to. So most of these organizations, even to refer to your earlier question, all these organizations were set up at a period when the economy or the global issues were not as strong as they are now. So they need to evolve to adjust to the demands of the day. So yes, we will have to change WTO rules. Yes, we will have to change, make it more transparent, bring in developing countries more into the decision-making system, and have a lot more accessibility for developing world into the developed market also, without those non-tariff barriers, without any of those, or actually at least help developing world in matching up to the developed world. So that is also something that the WTO can take care of. Those reforms are definitely needed for WTO to adjust it to the current demands of what is needed for the trade in these days.
So, ma'am, not just in terms of reforms, but as you said, there is a bias. Or even if we talk about the perception of bias between the developing world towards the functioning of WTO, can we say that this perception of bias or the bias in itself has been creating policies like ISI, like import substitution industrialization policies,
Sorry,
as well as
I
the
couldn't hear you
import
last.
I'm saying that the perceived biasness of institutions like WTO have prompted developing nations to follow the policies like import substitution and industrialization, along with making them have different groupings. Like we have the example of Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. They seek a certain kind of financial support along with the policies of trade, which WTO, IMF, and World Bank have failed to provide them. So, in the future of the economic growth as well as the economic relationship between the two countries, do we see much more cooperation between regional financial institutions and global financial institutions, or sort of competition?
Okay, so yeah, I didn't mention anything about World Bank and IMF, so I would like to bring in here. That was also part of the UN and the Bretton Woods system, and it did have a kind of a bias. And we know, I mean, during the Cold War, it was not something that the countries liked at all, or socialist-leaning countries liked at all. That IMF and World Bank were giving them aid only if they changed their, the structural adjustment plans. If they changed their economy, only then they would help them financially. That was something that many countries had refused. So WTO, when WTO is not a financial institution, those two were financial institutions. WTO came in as a trade organization. And the other financial institutions that came up were because we see the growth in Asian countries, the Asian development that happened in the 1960s and 70s, and the Asian tigers that came up. This was not happening because World Bank and IMF were providing aid. This happened because Japan found a way to bypass all of this and still help Asian countries in setting up their own businesses. So that Asian Development Bank, what the Japanese had set up in order to help Asian countries and provide them loans, took off in a major direction because the economy of these countries was growing leaps and bounds, and it was a sustained growth for 25 years, and that's how we have these Asian tigers coming up. And this is in spite of the strict rules that World Bank and IMF had in providing aid. We were also recipients, India was also a recipient of World Bank and IMF loans at the time. So every time we took loan or every time World Bank loan came in, we had to make adjustments in our own economy, which was something that many countries had not liked. And including countries like Japan and China were aware of this change. So China helped, earlier it was Japan who set up the ADB, and later on China also helped set up a bank to provide these financial loans to other countries. And they were doing it not without any restrictions placed on the countries. They were unlike IMF and World Bank, and so they were able to provide more loans to other Asian countries. So this diversified the amount of loan that was going to countries that did not change their economic structure. So World Bank and IMF helped those countries who were biased, I mean, who were with them, who could change their economies. And the other ones were other banks that were set up with the help of China, Japan, and even in South America, there were other banks that were set up. They helped countries that couldn't take loan from World Bank and IMF. So they are actually serving the purpose, but without the restrictions of the World Bank and IMF. And that actually helped. So yes, it may be fragmented, but it brought in more number of countries that could get financial help and aid and were able to develop a little bit more. Now the situation has changed into that financial world itself, the financial transactions themselves now have to have better governance system. What we see, what we saw with Russia, I mean, the American or the Western countries throwing Russia out of the SWIFT banking mechanism, we realized that if that SWIFT banking mechanism is the one that helps all countries transfer funds from between among the countries, and if that is a system that is set up by a few countries together, and if there is a conflict between the countries and they are easily thrown out, then there has to be something else that can step in, and that will happen. SWIFT was one mechanism that was there for transactions, financial transactions around the world. There will now be more number of those that will come up, just as it happened with loans that were not being given from World Bank and IMF. We have the ADB and other financial institutions coming up to take their place. This again will happen as a competition to SWIFT. And this is something that is, I think, that helps in evolving global governance systems, because you realize there is a lacuna in one, or maybe there is a bias in one. So you need something that is at the global level, which may become unbiased, which can give you more access to the world without having any ideological government level sovereignty. None of those become part of the requirement anymore. So you can get help whenever you need it. So that kind of a financial situation may arise, that kind of cooperation we may have to come up with, because these conflicts cannot, cannot derail the financial system, because it's going to affect more number of economies with globalization coming in. The more global we are, the more global governance we need, because otherwise globalization doesn't become globalization at all. It would have to be restricted, and countries would have to follow certain norms and regulations unless it is at a global level.
So I believe that covers major aspect of the economic stability in terms of the global governance. I would like to move on to another critical issue which has been in the news due to.
Can you please hold the mic to your mouth? I can't hear some of them. Yeah.
Is it clear now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so sorry. So I was just mentioning that it provides enough knowledge regarding the economic stability as per the global governance standard. Now, due to the efforts of Donald Trump, President, I would like to bring in the issue of climate change. So my next question would be that with an initiative like Paris Agreement, how effective do you think that the international mechanisms are in enforcing the climate commitments, and do we need much more stronger supranational authorities to enforce climate change policies globally?
Supranational, do we need supranational? Is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
ma'am. Just to ensure much more compliance towards the climate change policies.
Yeah, okay. So when we say global governance, I mentioned at the beginning that global governance works because you are not imposing authority on any country. And I said it is voluntary. So when we say a stronger supranational authority, countries still have to agree to come up with the supranational authority. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible for all countries to accept whatever the authorities say. What we have with the UN is all they have agreed to. What we have with WTO is all they have agreed to. If you force it on them, if you say, if the sanctions become much more authoritative, who is going to take up the authority? Which country will take up the authority? A supranational government, if we say United Nations again, or we set up another one that is similar to United Nations, who will you give the authority to? Would you have a military that the UN will have a military that can be sent to any country? But who will provide for that military? Who's going to pay for that military? Can UN have its own military? Will then who's going to be? United Nations doesn't have a country on its own, right? It is a group of countries. All countries will have to agree to send their troops if you are going to create a country. Sorry, if you are going to create an army to send anywhere or to send, impose authority on anybody, which doesn't happen. So what is it called now? It's called the peacekeeping force. They don't fight wars, they maintain peace. So if you are saying a supranational authority that is stronger, who will become the stronger authority? Which country will take up that responsibility of forcing everybody? And will all countries accept that supranational authority? It has to come from the countries themselves. They have to agree that we will follow, if this is the sanction, we will all follow it. We also know about International Court of Justice. International Court of Justice will not accept cases wherein both countries the parties to the case agree to bring it to the International Court of Justice. And if they don't agree, you can't reach the International Court of Justice. And even when the International Court of Justice passes a judgment, both countries will have to accept it. And if one were to say, I won't, there is only the only punishment they get is a sanction. There is nothing else. So how will we make anything supranational authority, stronger supranational authority, if all countries voluntarily do not accept that authority? It has to come as an authority accepted by all, only then. And countries do not like giving that authority up or giving their sovereignty up to another entity, because then it negates their sovereignty. So they do not like to share that sovereignty with anybody. UN is the most that they have agreed to. Yes, maybe UN sanctions can become stricter, and we may be able to impose a fine, maybe that would hamper them. But then what if they don't pay? Who's going to make them pay for it? We don't have international police that will go knocking doors on the governments and say, you pay up. Yeah, that doesn't happen. So thinking of a stronger supranational authority for me is a little bit of a problem, because we ourselves, countries, have to agree to set it up. And if they don't, it's difficult. The same way, I don't know if the reforms are in any country. I mean, the UN reforms are also similarly very difficult to impose, because the ones who have the veto authority will never give it up. So how will you reform the United Nations or even the Security Council if the countries that hold that authority never give it up? So in the climate change talks also, the same thing. I mean, I know you mentioned Paris Agreement and I went somewhere else. Even when we talk about climate talks, whatever agreements countries sign, and it's the COP26, COP, that's the Conference of the Parties. Those are the parties that have agreed to come and talk about climate change. So if the US were to say, I'm no longer interested in talking about climate change, no one can force them to come in. And that is exactly what is happening now. Trump says, Trump and his political party do not believe in climate change. So they don't want to talk about climate change, nor do they want to spend on mitigating climate change. So nobody can force them to come in. But how do we impose anything on the US then? If all other countries believe that US or the products that are coming from the US are the ones that pollute the environment too much, they will stop buying. If they were to stop buying those products, then it will put pressure on the US. Otherwise, it's never going to put pressure on the US. And those countries which are in the COP meetings, the conferences, in the talks that they are in, they have to be strong enough to even withstand multinational companies, petroleum companies, fossil fuel companies, and then withstand and say, this is what we want. And all those companies are, you heard of the controversy that happened in the recent climate talks that were there. The multinational companies were more than the number of the countries that were represented. So they were much more interested in how to stop countries from giving up on fossil fuel. It was not about changing the climate, or it was not about changing into alternative fuel, because they were worried about what will happen to their economy. So they were there to make sure that countries didn't come to an agreement that would hamper their business. So this is where the countries have to stand strong and say, if we are interested in climate change, we will go ahead and make our decisions. Companies will have to agree with us and not the other way around. So it's not a supranational, my point was, it's not supranational authority. It is the countries themselves that will have to settle this authority. It can't be that you can make a stronger supranational authority. You're muted.
In this particular context, other than the countries having a stronger framework for their domestic policies of climate change, on a global level, what reforms do you suggest that could bring out a realistic sense of reforms that could bring out a sustainable change in climate-related policies and a better implementation of targets that countries have themselves set for themselves at the Paris Agreement?
Yeah. The first thing, of course, that countries would have to believe that there is a risk involved in increased climate change. All countries have to believe it. And this is something that is very hard to convince people of different countries, because they don't see the change as easily as they see, job prospects or a disaster happening. They don't see the climate change. As long as you don't see it, it's harder to convince people that it is actually happening. Because even with the pandemic, there were reports that the WHO had warned countries about something like a pandemic happening in the next 10 years. No one paid attention to it. But when it actually happened, they realized that it is possible. And now that we are 2 years down the line, we haven't had a pandemic again coming back, governments are already forgetting it. So it has to be in the vision of the governments themselves that they become strong about climate change. They realize the potential that this is going to be a problem in the next 10 or 20 years. And not all countries face that problem. There are countries that are much more resilient and have much more resources and are not victims of this climate change yet. They don't see that happening to them very soon. But there are other countries which are so vulnerable, like the island countries, that they have to talk about this more and more. And so it is about convincing the rest of the world that this is a problem that everybody needs to face. And I think it actually comes from the grassroots level, because issues like racism, social issues work better when it is bottom up, when the people themselves start believing that this is something that is completely wrong, and they make their governments change the policies. That is when changes happen. But if people don't believe it, and if people are not participating in that policy change, governments can't do anything. And at the global level, if the governments are not doing anything, at the global level, nothing works. So it has to be a grassroots movement going up instead of, the sustainable goals that we are talking about. In India also, we have sustainable goals being, I won't say imposed, but they are the ones that are the central government is telling the rest of the states to follow the sustainable goals that the UN has set up. If there was a push from the state governments, or even at the village level, if there was a push from that side, the implementation would have been much, much better, because it is about helping at the local level, so that awareness, that acknowledgement has to come from the grassroots level for the sustainable goals to be actually effective. Or achieving those goals can happen only if local governments are involved, only if the people are involved. Otherwise, top-down approach in sustainable goal achievement is not something that will work out. You may make any policy at the government level. If the people are not aware of it and are not following it, how will it work at all? You may have made several schemes to alleviate poverty. If people have no clue what those schemes are, how will that help the poor people at all? It won't help them unless they are aware of it. So it has to be a bottom-up approach and not a top-down approach when we talk about sustainable development goals, climate change, any of these global issues. All of them have to be a bottom-up approach.
So, ma'am, moving towards the last question of the session, the last topic. In terms of balancing the global enforcing standards like human rights, democracy, labor laws, that West advocates for, how do we balance these standards with respect to the national sovereignty, especially in the regions which are resistant to these kind of external influence? And how does the whole Asian value debate come into the picture of this particular aspect?
Yeah. So I think I've already mentioned a couple of times the Banana Republic thing, and climate change also becomes a question on the national sovereignty because, the stand that the developing countries take about climate change is that it's a differentiated responsibility, right? So they say that the developed world has already polluted the whole world. So why are you punishing the developing world who have to take care of development? So I can't worry about the climate issues at this point of time. But I mean, our population and the US population are quite different. Then we are 1.5 billion, and if we were to pollute the earth like the Americans have done, I don't think the earth can stand it for the next 100 years also. So we do have to be careful because we have a huge population. The national sovereignty issue comes up here that there is a differentiated uh, need and the responsibility for both developed and the developing world. And so developing world does not like it when it is imposed on them, when it is especially coming from developed world and saying you should reduce everything, you should cut down on the fossil fuel usage of fossil fuels, you should do this, you should do that. When the conditions come in, they feel that they are interfering in the national sovereignty of these countries. It's the same about political decisions also, that you side with them, you have to agree. The same, the non NPT, nuclear non-proliferation treaty, that we were asked to sign, and India did not like that because we felt that it was a bias, and we felt that they were impinging on our sovereignty. It's our autonomy. It's our decision as to whether we develop a nuclear weapon or not. These are, policy decisions that the countries um, will always want to take. But then if they are forced to take something else, of course they will bristle. They will not like it. So how do we balance the two? How do we make sure that there are global issues that everybody needs to cooperate on, and it can't be based on one country's need or want? Is again, it's a convincing act that the UN or any international organization has to do. That is, of course, it is possible if there is a leader who is charismatic enough. I mean, secretary generals there have been a few who have been charismatic enough to convince the rest of the world that this is an issue that they have to focus on. It will work with all the other countries, and the countries also have to feel the need to participate in this and not feel that it is just the sovereignty that is being questioned here, and that every country is not against us. Every country is doing it because they don't want to see another world war, or they don't want to see another pandemic in this century or the next. So they will cooperate on that. So it needs, I mean, yes, the international organization or the global governance does have that responsibility of convincing everybody to come together, and it's not an easy task. Can you imagine 200 countries convincing 200 countries? You can't even convince 200 people in a room. It's very hard to convince 200 countries with all national interests. But that is the task for the global governance, to say that this is a global priority. This has to be the global issue. So I guess the leadership matters here in this case. A leader who is charismatic enough, who can convince the countries that this is something that has to be done, is one way of going about finding this, the balance between sovereignty and adhering to a global norm, or adhering to a global issue, or thinking about a global issue.
So Thank you, ma'am, for this extremely insightful session. So now the floor is open for discussion. Anyone who has questions can please raise hand. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hi, good afternoon.
Uh, Thanks. It's a privilege to share the platform with you. My question will be regarding two aspects of today's globalization. Like in today's era, the word globalization is more used instead of word international. Yes, so how you see the nexus governance that is global and governance in the global? uh, how do you see and why? Uh, how do you see that the security issues are still being discussed in the Westphalian ideas, depending on Westphalian ideas? And my second question will be on the jurisdiction system. So depending of the supranational legislation and individual empowerment, increasing awareness of human security. So both this security issue and the jurisdiction issue, how do you see that both in terms of shifting of power dynamics in this globalization era?
Okay. First question about globalization, global governance in globalization and domestic governance in globalization, right? The governance in both at the global level and at the national level in the globalization. So there was a talk in between during the pandemic that the world is deglobalizing, that countries no longer want to be part of this. I mean, yes, during the pandemic, the global supply chain had broken. Okay, countries couldn't depend on somebody else to supply things for them. The whole supply chain from one end to the other had broken because all of them had closed off their borders. So there was a talk that it was becoming deglobalized, that countries were becoming more and more independent, and that this was the end of globalization. That was the talk just 2, 3 years back. If you look at the scholarly articles, you will see a number of them about talking about deglobalization. But once the pandemic was over, you realize that they're back to that globalization because that is the best way to go about production, the way about making any product, the best way to, or the cheapest way to do things. And this is very useful for capitalists or even companies because no company wants to do it on its own and increase the cost of a product. They would rather make it cheaper and better by collaborating with others. So there is a talk about re-globalization now. It's not deglobalization, it is re-globalization because countries have realized that they can't do it on their own, that they have to depend on somebody else. So at this point, you realize that there is no going back from globalization anymore. There is no way that we can become completely isolated and live on our own. Even though Trump wants to make it very isolationist, he's not going to be very successful in doing that because US economy depends on the rest of the world. If the rest of the world were to say, forget about US economy would collapse. US knew this even after World War II. They rebuilt Europe because their economy depended on Europe. They have to help rest of the world now in order for them to buy US goods. Otherwise, US economy would collapse. US doesn't have the number of people they produce for. How much more can you feed American people? It has to come out of US because they do produce a lot more. So for them to be profitable, they have to depend on the other countries. So we have reached a stage that we need global collaboration. We have reached a stage where we can't do without global governance. It has to be there because every country now depends on another country. So whatever happens in one country will always affect another country. So in this case, even local governments have to remember that whatever happens in their country may affect other countries also. No, I'm not saying they should worry about it, but they should keep that in mind that local incidents will have global implications. So when you govern locally as well, you need to keep that in mind that may affect a global issue. that may bring it into the focus of a global issue. Sorry, I forgot your second question. About security, you were saying about security.
The security issues are still being seen uh, in respect of Westphalian ideas. What is your point
Sure.
of view?
So security, I mean, we still think about, when we say security, we still think in a traditional manner. Security is military. Okay, security is all about having armies, having nuclear weapons, having, amassing weapons, and that's how we will protect our own. Our alliances have a great ally and we will be safe. That's no longer security. That's not just traditional security anymore. We have other types of security that we need to worry about. We need to worry about food, water, energy. All of these are involved. They don't need armies for security anymore. If we can't feed the people, if we can't provide drinking water to the people, our own country is at risk. If we can't provide the energy security, our country is at risk. So yes, we still think about Westphalian idea about that traditional security and army, but we have realized that even health matters. Even providing security through health also matters nowadays. So nobody is going to forget that. And we already are in a situation where we have to worry about water security. All countries are realizing this, and all countries know this now. Energy security is at the top of the list for most countries because all countries are not independent on energy needs. They are dependent on some other country. Why do you think most of us worry about any war in West Asia? Because we know that energy supply gets disrupted. If there's any war in West Asia, that's the first thing that is to be hit. What happened when Russia invaded Ukraine? Indian foreign minister was talking about food, fuel, fertilizer being affected. That is the security we are talking about. Russia-Ukraine war has nothing to do with India. We are not going to be attacked by any missile or any bomb or anything. Too far for us. Why did we worry about it? We were worried because our food supply, we used to get wheat, bread from Ukraine, that was disrupted. Fuel was disrupted. Fertilizer was disrupted. All these were something that we need to worry about. So security, we may think about that, but every country has realized that it is not only the military security that provides security for people, it's all other things as well. We do have that realization now.
Ma'am, I would like to add one more question.
No. I think there are other people. I think we should limit it to.
If we do
Is it
have
okay,
the time,
Janmay?
we'll roll back to you. But
Yeah.
right now we have to ask. So yes, you can ask your question now.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for giving me this opportunity. My question is that how have been the tech oligarchs shaped the geopolitics in recent years, and will it impact and influence the future of global politics and governance? As we are visible enough that how Elon Musk and the tech oligarchs are taking control of the decision making, and also recently the Chinese uh, s- AI model creator has got a seat in the political highlight groups. So my question is, what will be the future of it?
Okay. I personally feel that it is there 15 minutes of fame, and that it is not going to last for too long because we've had this before. I mean, I don't know if you remember when Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and even when the Facebook was introduced, it was Mark Zuckerberg. They were all the tech oligarchs, and the people were talking only about them and that they have a lot of influence. And we see that influence coming down. It doesn't last for too long. It lasts as long as there isn't a new technology that is coming over. As soon as there is a new technology, as soon as there is something new that comes up, that person becomes important. So right now it is Elon Musk's 15 minutes of fame, and everybody is realizing that by giving governance in the hands of people who are not experienced, you're going to cause a lot of problems. And I know there are lots of people who are fans of Elon Musk. They liked him a lot for whatever he did for technology. But I want to know whether what he's doing for the governance system is that going to be something that is effective? And again, I'm going to give him 4 more years to see where that fame is going to come down. I'm not going to comment on Elon Musk right now, but tech oligarchy lasts only as long as there is no new technology. Once there is a new technology, you will see, you did see that with Chinese, the DeepSeek that came up, and everything else collapsed. All other AI platforms were now, floundering, and they were wondering what happened suddenly one morning. Okay, so as long as there may be a competition to the Chinese tech that has come up, there may be a competition from the Japanese. They already have robots who think and talk and who might help you with everything that you need. So as long as there is no new technology, this tech oligarch works. As soon as there's a new one, it changes. How will that impact governance and global governance? Global governance needs a lot more collaboration with other countries so that one country's global oligarch may not be able to impact the other countries to a large extent. So they will have to collaborate with other countries to be able to impact them. So this is one of the reasons why tech oligarchies may not influence global governance to that extent, but there may be a little bit of an impact on that. Janmeja, I have just 5 minutes. I will have to go after this.
Ma'am, can we take one last question? We have one in chat
No.
box. One quick question. We have a question from Aishwarya. She says that will the globalization trend start to become much more decentralized in nature as compared to the past when we had a centralized nature of globalization?
Does the globalization trend started to be more decentralized in nature in the near future as compared to centralized? Globalization was not centralized. That's why we called it global. It was global because there were many centers, which were why we felt that it was centralized was because there was one country that was more economically more powerful than the other. So now that we have number of countries that have taken up, or that it has diversified, that it is not concentrated only in one country, that we do see that it is, you might feel that it is decentralized, but global can't be centralized. If it is centralized, then it is imperialism or hegemony. You might call it the economic hegemon. So globalization by nature is decentralized. It will continue to help. It will impact other countries. So once again, if one country like the United States, if United States is the one that is the most powerful, it will impact all other countries. But if there are multiple sources of power, like the European Union, like China, like Korea, you do see their influence being impacting on other countries. So you may not see American influence as much in Southeast Asia as much as you would see China or South Korea. You do see that difference even here in India. We may want to have a lot more American products initially. We know that it is too expensive or they don't suit Indian purpose anymore. We will go towards Japan. We go towards China. We go towards South Korea. Whatever is much more accessible to us, whatever is much more suitable for our own purpose, we will take on that. That's the charm of globalization, that you don't have to depend on one. You have the choice of multiple countries or multiple products at the same time. That's what the charm of the globalization is. So it is by nature decentralized. It may seem centralized at times because there's one country that has taken over the whole, the idea in globalization, or the influencer in the globalized world.
Definitely. I hope Aishwarya that does answer your question. And thanks a lot, ma'am. This was a really insightful session. And we are so glad to have you there on this.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. I wish I had more time for question and answer, but thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Global Eye as well. Thank you.